Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar on managing stress and anxiety. I know quite a few of us are probably feeling a little bit of those pressures right now, and I think it's a good thing to be here and learning a little bit more about what we can do to help ourselves. I'd like to also thank Evan Plys, who's here with us today from the University of Colorado Palliative Care Unit, who's going to be speaking with us today. So thank you so much for joining us. A couple of housekeeping things before we start. We are going to have a question and answer session at the very end, so please hold your questions until then. There are a couple of different ways to ask your questions. The first way that you can ask questions is if you navigate over to your control panel for GoToWebinar. There should be a drop-down questions panel. You can type your questions in there. Those will be sent directly to me. If they're questions on audio or something technical, I'll answer them right away. But if they are about the presentation, I'll go ahead and hold those and ask them for you at the very end. The other option to ask your questions is to raise your hand. So if there's a little raise your hand on your control panel that you can shoot up. And if you do that, I can unmute you and you can ask your question directly. If you do this, please make sure that you have a microphone equipped in your computer so that way we can hear you. There will be a follow-up email to this that will come out tomorrow, and included in that will be the handouts that you can find in your drop-down menu on your control panel, as well as a copy of the slides and a recording of the session. So there will be a follow-up email, and so you can share some of these resources with people you love as well. A couple of things that are going on with the Parkinson Association. We've got a couple of other webinars coming up in the month of May, and we're trying to add more and more every day, so keep an eye out. But our first is we are continuing with a Master and Commander of the Good Ship Parkinsons series with Greg Richer, who has just published a book called Rising Above Parkinsons, and it's all about developing a patient-oriented plan for yourselves and how to identify different roles and goals and factors in your life that are helping you deal with your Parkinson's disease. So that happens every Wednesday. We started the first Wednesday in May, and we're kind of moving our way through May, and every Wednesday at 2 p.m. And so if you feel like joining us, feel free to join us on next Wednesday. We also have recordings of the last session, so you can brush up before you join us. We have another webinar that's called Parkinson's Disease More Than Motor Symptoms, which will focus on some of the cognitive changes that can happen in Parkinson's. And that will be happening on Thursday, May 28th from 10 to 11 a.m. All of these programs are listed on our website, www.parkinsonrockies.org. And if you go to parkinsonrockies.org/online programs, there's a list there that is regularly updated, and you can see what else we have going for you. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and switch over the presentation to you, Evan, and we can get going.
Thanks so much. Okay, is that coming in okay?
Yep, we can see you.
Awesome. All right, thanks so much for having me. Again, my name's Evan Plys. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus, and I specialize in mental health and aging particularly. I've also been working, as mentioned, in palliative care for the past couple of years, and so I'm really excited to speak with you all about this topic that is increasingly relevant around stress and anxiety, particularly in the context of a global pandemic. So today we're going to go through, I'm categorizing this presentation to 3 stages. I'm going to call it the 3 I's. We're going to start by just going over some general information around stress and anxiety. Then we're going to move into interventions and ways that we can cope with stress and anxiety immediately in our environment. And then we'll talk about some of the implications, particularly for individuals with a Parkinson's diagnosis and their family members. And we'll finish up with some Q&As. And I do want to call attention to this neat little background that I found that is motion activated. I've been feeling really inspired by these commercials for the Calm meditation app, where it's just 30 seconds of really just engaging with something in your environment and trying to turn your mind off. And sometimes I forget how much we actually need that, particularly nowadays. So let's start off by going over just some basic information around stress, anxiety, and particularly in the context of Parkinson's disease. So it's really no surprise to the individuals on this call that we see really high rates of mental health concerns in the context of Parkinson's disease. These are some of the non-motor symptoms associated with the disorder. So in research studies, we see samples, almost 50% of some samples are reporting anxiety, depression, chronic sleep problems, and fatigue in the context of having a Parkinson's diagnosis. It's really high rates of psychological concerns that accompany this disorder. We also know from previous research that, and again, this shouldn't be a surprise, during a crisis or disaster, those impacted by that disaster see an increase in psychological distress. So I was actually reading an article today that had some data across the globe. So the sample was thousands of people across various countries, and they found that 75% of individuals surveyed were reporting heightened worry right now about COVID, contracting the illness, and also the financial and other implications of that. And it's worth noting that 80% of the sample also acknowledged that they weren't at immediate risk. They didn't have existing risk factors. They felt like their level of contracting the virus was quite low, but they were still reporting really elevated worry and some of these psychological symptoms during the pandemic. And what we know from previous either health concerns or natural disasters, that most people following when we remove the disaster will return to some level of baseline psychological functioning and be resistant to this prolonged mental health concerns. However, the individuals that tend to have those longer lasting implications of something like a pandemic or disaster are those with pre-existing psychological distress. So that does put people who might find themselves currently having symptoms of depression or anxiety at a higher risk for potentially having longer courses of that exacerbation that we're seeing during this pandemic. The other thing that research has shown that's relevant to the context of Parkinson's is that acute or chronic psychological stress might actually exacerbate some of the motor symptoms that we see that accompany Parkinson's disease. And so also taking this collectively, this isn't just to talk about doom and gloom. It's really important, particularly for individuals with Parkinson's, particularly for family members and people with already pre-existing high levels of psychological distress. It is especially important now to engage in healthy coping strategies and to be really aware of the mental health implications that we're seeing during this pandemic. Now, I think the other thing that's really important to consider around the context of Parkinson's disease is the fact that we've been exposed to stress before in our life. So as I mentioned, my background's really in geriatrics and aging. And there's a theory in thinking about how older adults respond to distressing situations called the stress inoculation hypothesis. And I think this hypothesis is actually really, the analogy is very fitting, obviously, when we're talking about the COVID virus and antibodies, and we're all looking for that vaccination. But the general idea is that individuals have experienced negative life events throughout their life. And this is particularly true of older adults who have lived a long time and had a lot of exposure to life. And individuals cope with that. They might have an initial shock, but eventually they cope with those strengths and they identify these strengths that they then take into future stressful situations. So there was a study about 5 years ago that sampled individuals living in New York and New Jersey. And they collected a sample of people who had been exposed to 9/11 and who had also been exposed to Hurricane Sandy. And they found that for older adults in their sample, those who reported high levels of stress during 9/11 actually reported less stress during Hurricane Sandy. And they found the opposite results in younger adults, where those who reported high stress during 9/11 actually reported higher stress during Hurricane Sandy. And so this study really provided some support, and other studies have replicated this as well, that particularly as we age, we develop these strategies and these strengths around how to manage stress. And this is particularly true of individuals with any chronic illness, Parkinson's being no exception, that individuals who have this diagnosis and their families have experienced negative life events before. So I would imagine that the majority of individuals out there would say that, you know, they've experienced stress either related to having the diagnosis of Parkinson's or otherwise. And so it's important to identify what are those coping strategies that you've already built up as you've dealt with some negative life events. And then today we'll talk about how can we add or supplement some of those strategies with maybe additional strategies that either we're not doing or we're not thinking about on the forefront of our mind. But I do want to recognize that while individuals and families who are managing a Parkinson's diagnosis have unique stressors and high rates of pre-existing psychological concerns, they also have tremendous volumes of strength and resiliency to tap into. So thinking about what stress and anxiety is, just generally speaking, stress is a physiological response to something happening in our immediate environment. So you'll see the cartoon here on the left, and this is an individual who's come across a mouse or a rat, and this is evoking some sort of physiological stress response to this creature that they've come across in their environment. And so this essentially this stress response is pretty much the fight or flight response, which we've probably heard before. And so this is our body responding, again, to something that's evoking fear in our immediate environment. And it's our heart rate elevating, or we might be breathing faster, our muscles are getting tense, again, to keep us safe to either fight the object that's in our environment or flee to keep ourselves from having harm associated to whatever is evoking that fear response. It usually goes away because we change our environment, and then we might experience this again if something comes up in our external environment. Anxiety actually evokes a very similar response, that same fight or flight stress response. But what differentiates it from some of this fear is that it's usually an internal experience rather than something that we're observing in our external world. So anxiety typically starts with our thoughts, and it typically starts with thoughts about the future. So worrying that, as you see in this figure here, worrying that we might encounter a rat in the future and that might turn out bad for us. And so as we're going through that internal process of thinking about this potential fearful event in the future, our body is responding in a very similar way, evoking that stress response. And one of the other things that differentiates anxiety and stress is that anxiety tends to last longer. In a stress response, we can remove ourselves from that situation and it tends to go away. We're not very good at removing ourselves from our thoughts, and so those tend to stick around a little bit longer. And anxiety can produce negative health effects long term if we're experiencing that fight or flight response over and over and over again. Now, I also want to stress, no pun intended, I also want to make sure that we acknowledge that stress is also adaptive. So the reason that we have this response in our environment or even to thoughts in our mind is that historically it has kept us safe. So this is one of those evolutionary features that has allowed us to survive in the wilderness. So if we were to encounter a big predatory animal, we would engage in this stress response to alert us that danger is afoot. And so by allowing us to concentrate and prepare our body to fight or flight, we are keeping ourselves safe in our immediate environment. And so while that's a very rare encounter, most of us won't be encountering animals like that, we also see that stress can be kind of adaptive even when it's in our mind, that anxiety can be adaptive sometimes. If you think about a test and having test anxiety, essentially your mind is telling you that there's something in the future that's important and that could potentially be stressful or anxiety provoking or fearful, and it motivates you to do something about that. So stress anxiety motivates us to study, get a good night's sleep if we can, prepare that day of. So all types of stress can actually be really adaptive for helping us in certain situations if we have the right level. So you'll see the figure on the right here is this stress curve. And if we think about stress on a continuum, we can have too little stress or we can have too much stress. And so we really want to find ourselves in this yellow category where we're maximizing our stress to be productive and motivated and engaging in healthy behaviors. But if we go too far or if we have too little, then we can start to see negative effects. So during COVID, obviously we're experiencing heightened stress and anxiety. And if we're in that adaptive range, that's actually keeping us safe in some regards. So if you felt no stress or anxiety about contracting COVID, then you probably wouldn't have a lot of motivation to adhere to physical distancing guidelines. You probably wouldn't be sanitizing. You might not change your behaviors as far as washing your hands. So in that sense, actually having a little bit of stress and a little bit of anxiety has actually kept us safe and has helped us stop or halt or slow down some of the spread of the virus by adhering to these guidelines. Now, what we worry about happening is going over this hump into the orange and red zones here, where that stress and anxiety becomes too much and can lead to health impacts. So when we find ourselves in this red zone here, this is when things like irritability and anger start coming up. If we have existing ailments, we might see an increase in chronic pain, really a hard time sleeping, a lot of insomnia symptoms, digestive problems, difficulty concentrating, change in appetite. So some of these psychosomatic symptoms really occur when we find ourselves in too much of a stressful, in experiencing too much stress. So the goal here isn't to alleviate stress. Stress management isn't about getting rid of stress because one, that's really hard to do, particularly during a global pandemic. But two, sometimes stress can be adaptive. So we want to make sure that we're maximizing how we're engaging with stress and preventing it from getting into that red zone. But we don't necessarily, the goal isn't necessarily to get rid of stress completely. And so thinking about anxiety, as I mentioned, anxiety really is a disorder that starts with the thoughts and starts with these future-oriented thoughts. Something is going to happen in the future that's going to be bad, and I'm going to have a really hard time coping with that. And it starts this cycle from the thoughts to how we respond emotionally, how we respond physically, and then our behaviors. So an example that we might see nowadays is you might be having the thought that I'm going to get COVID, I'm going to lose all my money, and I won't be able to afford healthcare to treat the COVID, if that's even an option, if I even survive. And this is an anxiety-provoking thought. Then the feeling that's attached to that thought might be fear, it might be grief. You might start to feel some sadness around worrying so much about losing a loved one that you've already started to think about what it might be for them to be gone. And then physiological responses that come with that around shortness of breath, increased heart rate, really having this anxiety, this stressful response in your thoughts and your feelings in your body. And anxiety is a disorder of avoidance. So this cycle is really negative. It's a bad experience. We don't want to think these thoughts. We don't want to feel these feelings, either emotionally or physiologically. And so the way that we respond to that typically is through avoidance. So PTSD is in the anxiety disorder category, and very much a disorder of avoidance. And every type of anxiety has some level of avoidance of these stress-evoking experiences. So a lot of times what we see is the behavioral response is using substances or distracting ourselves in some way, watching TV obsessively, stress eating. And again, these actions are really designed to get out of that cycle of anxiety, to end it there, to not have to experience some of these stressful thoughts and physiological and emotional responses. And we know this cycle can cause health impacts. It can just make life really, really challenging. Nobody likes to be anxious. Nobody likes to be stressed. So in thinking about this cycle, we want to really maximize where can we actually intervene to disrupt this cycle from getting worse and from snowballing into long-term health implications. So now I want to move into thinking more about what are some of the interventions that we can do to cope with some of these stressors. And a lot of the tools that I'll be talking about are consistent with acceptance and commitment therapy. And this is a type of psychotherapy that has a lot of evidence behind it for treating disorders like anxiety. And so that means that there's been a lot of research studies that have shown that individuals who have anxiety, who engage in these types of interventions, can actually successfully manage their anxiety in future events. Now, I find that this type of therapy is really effective for older adults and people with illness, because a lot of it is about just accepting that there are some things that are out of our control. And we don't need to change every single environment. Sometimes we can't escape stress in our life. We need to learn best how to maximize our efficiency with dealing with that stress and making sure that we're still engaging in healthy behaviors, even though stress comes up in life. And I think this is very relevant now because none of us can escape the stress of coronavirus. Anywhere we go, we will still be in a threatening situation where there is this global pandemic occurring. And so we want to make sure that we're engaging in behaviors that are within our control, and we're not getting swept up in this loss of control that can spiral to more anxiety. So the first tip is to really focus on what we can control. We want to make sure that we're getting the most bang for our buck and return on investment for our time. We only have limited resources as people. Our time is limited, our energy is limited. And so we want to make sure that we're investing that time and energy into things that we can actually make a difference for. So a lot of times we think, well, if I can just get rid of these anxious thoughts, I can just not feel anxiety, then I won't be anxious. that makes sense, and very, very challenging to not have these very naturally occurring thoughts and feelings. If you think about spending all day tomorrow in front of the TV watching news about coronavirus for 24 hours straight, how successful do you think you'd be if 24 hours hearing about coronavirus, not having any thoughts about potentially yourself or someone you love contracting the virus, or feeling any anxiety or sadness or threat around what you're seeing? These thoughts and these feelings are really natural, and they're very hard to control because they're a reaction to what we're getting, what environmental stimuli is coming into our body. So I like this quote from Russ Harris, who's an author and a psychologist who does a lot of work around acceptance and commitment therapy. And he recently published a guide for managing stress during COVID. And I'll summarize this. He talks about, we obviously can't control the future. We don't know what's going to happen. Investing our time in controlling events that are in the future is not really a good, again, return on investment. So we can't control that. We can't control the coronavirus itself. We can't control the economy or the way that our government responds to the coronavirus. We can't alter these natural fears and anxieties that are just occurring with this global pandemic. But what we can control are the actions that we do in the here and now, and that's actually significant. So even though a lot of what's going on and fueling this stress and anxiety is completely beyond our control, the fact that we can actually focus on the behaviors that we're doing in the here and now can actually be quite powerful, because that means we get to dictate our behaviors. We get to dictate what we're doing in the moment, and then that can actually lead to staying healthy or not. So making sure that we're recognizing that the behaviors we're doing right now are within our control, and if we're making sure that we're allocating our time and our resources to those behaviors, then we can maximize our health and during this pandemic, even if we are experiencing anxiety. Now, the next point is to open up and really allow yourself to experience some of these anxiety-provoking thoughts and emotions. So again, anxiety is all about avoidance. We try to get rid of or escape these negative anxiety-provoking thoughts, and a lot of times escaping them causes us more problems because they're kind of naturally occurring. So one way to engage with and experience those thoughts and emotions is to distance yourself from them a little bit by calling them out as what they are, as these subjective experiences. So if you think about being in Times Square and you look around and there's all the monitors surrounding you, and at the bottom of the monitors in Times Square, you see this ticker, and it portrays the news headlines, the stock tips, and it's just going rapidly a mile a minute. If we were to all have tickers across our forehead that displayed our thoughts, you start to see some of the things that run through your mind. You'd probably see some thoughts that are really tied to what you're doing in the moment, to what the sensory input that you're getting. And you also might see some thoughts that are completely off the wall, that are completely out of left field and random, and that's just what our mind does. Thoughts are this subjective experience that our mind creates, yet sometimes we give them a lot of power by thinking that our thoughts are reality. So if I went up to a friend and said, I'm going to die of coronavirus, they might be like, whoa, what do I not know that's going on in your life? If I were to change my language a little bit to say, I'm having the thought that I'm going to die from coronavirus, they might be like, oh yeah, me too. We all have that. The latter is actually more accurate. You're having the thought that blank. So just because you think it doesn't make it reality. And when you start to change your language to appreciate that these thoughts are randomly occurring, that they're subjective experiences created by our minds, then it makes it almost more palatable to start to engage with some of these thoughts and feelings. So we want to notice, again, what's going on, not only in our mind, but also in our body. We want to notice our physical sensations, our emotional experiences. One, because we know anxiety is all about avoidance, so we want to combat that with acceptance. But also because, as we mentioned earlier on, sometimes these thoughts and feelings and physiological reactions can give us valuable information. So when we're really tapped in and exploring what we're experiencing in that moment, we can actually extract pretty useful information from that, rather than engaging in this experience of trying to escape some of these negative thoughts. So one way to think of it is when we have our detective hats on and we're really approaching our experience with curiosity, it really makes it a lot less distressing, because we're, rather than really immersing ourselves in this negativity, we're trying to extract what valuable information can I actually get from some of these emotional, physiological, and cognitive reactions that I might be having. And then another strategy is to bring ourselves to the present. So as we talked about, anxiety really comes from these thoughts that are often future oriented. So worrying about the future, worrying about something that we can't really control. However, we can control what's going on in the present. But it's kind of hard sometimes to transition from this future orientation to what's going on in the here and now, especially when we're caught up in that anxiety cycle that we showed earlier on with the thoughts, feelings, reactions, and behaviors. So one way to bring ourselves to the present is called a grounding exercise. And I actually want to go over this with everyone right now. So I want to lead you through a really quick grounding exercise to bring ourselves from this anxiety future-oriented mode to the present, to make sure that we're engaging in things we can control. So I would encourage everyone to find a comfortable seated position or standing, and just notice what you're feeling right now. And on a scale of 1 to 10, so 1 being no stress at all, 10 being extreme, most stress possible, just rate where you are. Either write it down or say it out loud, think it. Just rate yourself 1 to 10, how much anxiety you're feeling in this moment. Okay. And so now I'm going to lead you through this grounding exercise. And again, find this comfortable position and first start to notice your breath. Don't need to change anything. We're just noticing the air come in. Try to track where that air flows throughout your body, and then feel the air coming out. And so just notice a couple times the air coming in, having the breath, having the air leave your body. And again, we're not changing our experience, we're just noticing. Now, I'd like you to bring your awareness to the room around you and just name 5 things that you can see. So we're looking for small details like a pattern, or the way the light reflects on something, a color, an object that we didn't notice was there. But we're just scanning the room for 5 different things that we can see. And now we're bringing our attention to 4 things that we can feel. So notice the sensation of clothing on your body, different textures, something that's an object that might be warm or cold, something that might be heavy or light. But just touch 4 different things in your immediate surrounding and notice what they feel like. And now we're going to move to hearing. So I want you to pay attention to your surroundings and see if there are some sounds that you may have turned out, like a clock, or traffic in the background, wind, my voice. Just notice 3 things that you can hear. And now I want you to notice 2 things that you can smell. So they might be smells in the air around you, like an air freshener or the air from outside. If you were to do this later on your own, you might pick up a candle or a flower, or I have coffee next to me and I can smell that. But try to notice 2 things that you can smell. And then lastly, what is 1 thing that you can taste? So again, in the future, if you're doing this, you may want to carry a stick of gum or candy or snack and notice the flavors that come into your mouth from that. But just try to notice the flavors of 1 thing that you can taste. And now let's come back to the presentation. And I want you to do the same thing you did before around rating 1 through 10 where your stress level is. And so hopefully some people noticed that their stress level changed, even if it was a small amount in a positive direction, meaning less stress from after that exercise. And if you think about it, we really did that in about 2 minutes. So that was a pretty low investment of time, and hopefully you're seeing some benefits in stress reduction and also in bringing you to the present. So this can be really helpful, particularly when we notice that we're spiraling in those anxiety thoughts and into the future, and it's snowballing around disaster, disaster, disaster. Doing this type of exercise to bring us to the present can be really therapeutic because we're really not as good at multitasking as we think we are. So as we're flooding our brain with all of this sensory input in our immediate environment, it's kind of hard for us to also worry about these things in the future because we're really not as good at multitasking as we think we are. And then the last thing, as we've addressed, some of the anxiety-provoking thoughts and making sure that we're in the present, we also want to make sure that we're engaging in behaviors that are meaningful and that we know exactly how to respond in these situations, particularly the ones that are causing us anxiety. So I want to lead us through another really quick exercise. And for this, if you have a pen or paper accessible, that'd be great. Or if you want to pull up a Word document to type, or even just think or speak out loud, I want us to imagine that next year, 2021, maybe 2022, that we're at a birthday party and we're surrounded by our loved ones, our best friends, our family, and people are giving speeches about you. And particularly, they're giving speeches about how you managed yourself during the coronavirus. So I want you to spend a minute really thinking about or writing down what you would want your loved ones to say about you for how you manage yourself during COVID. So, how do you want to be seen? How do you want other people to perceive that you treated yourself and others? So just spend a minute to really think about what an ideal speech would be like next year for someone saying how you manage yourself during COVID. It's been about 10 more seconds, finishing up. Okay, and then after this presentation, I would really encourage everyone to go back to what they started to write and finish it, or if you were able to finish, what that speech would look like, to revisit it and try to identify themes. So 1 to 2 word themes, or short phrases that are really sticking out, just a couple, maybe 2 or 3 for that whole speech. And those themes, we're going to call those your values. And those are really helpful in thinking about how do we respond in stressful situations? How do we respond in a way that's healthy and feels good to us? Those themes that you've identified then become essentially your compass, your guide for how to act in certain situations. And the other guide that I think is really important, particularly now, around around engaging in healthy behaviors, is to also stay safe, and we do that by staying informed. So making sure that, one, we're keeping in mind our values and how we want to be perceived about how we've responded and managed ourselves during this crisis, and also that we have really solid information from public health experts about what is safe and what might be pushing it. And so let's apply some of this knowledge to situations that we might find ourselves in during COVID. So as we're opening up some states, certainly here in Colorado, we might find ourselves in a situation where we're actually invited out to a dinner party, or the world around us is starting to open up, and we're maybe feeling a pull to engage in quote unquote normal behaviors again. And so let's say I got a text message from a friend inviting me over to a dinner party. And the cycle that I'm going through is, well, if I go, I'll certainly contract the virus. That makes me feel anxious. My heart starts racing, start breathing faster, and everything in my mind is telling me to do something to avoid this feeling. So either don't text them, either tell them off, anything to get rid of this anxious thought and this cycle. So applying what we just, the skills that we just reviewed, we want to first focus on what's controllable. So we know that whether we get the virus or not is not really, certainly not directly in our control. These thoughts, these feelings, this physiological reaction isn't really in our control. But we know that we can control how we respond to this invitation. We can invest in this behavioral response. And so opening up to really allow ourselves to experience those thoughts and those feelings, distancing ourselves a little bit by saying, I'm having the thought that if I go, I'll contract the virus. And using that to say, well, okay, there's some merit there. We don't have a vaccination. I certainly might be putting myself at risk, and I don't know for sure that if I go, I'm going to get the virus. And then, bringing ourselves to the present to stop this cycle from continuing, and really to focus on how do we respond to this invitation. So we might do the grounding technique that we just practiced. And then we want to use those values-based strategies to formulate an action that works for us and also keeps us safe. So how do I respond in a way that's congruent with those 2 or 3 core values that I've identified for myself? And also, how does that relate to staying safe? So, I might ask if we're going to be physical distancing the party. Are we going to be wearing face masks? Do we need to, maybe we should have a Zoom call instead. Or maybe I won't go, but I'll send a bottle of wine. Whatever your values are directing you to do, and also countering that with, is it safe and is it consistent with what I'm reading in these guidelines about safety? That is really going to help us formulate an action here to manage some of these situations that we might be anxiety provoking and leave us in this how do I respond type mindset. And one of the other considerations that I think is particularly important in the context of having a Parkinson's diagnosis is that things like stress and anxiety are not just they don't lead to just psychological and behavioral implications, but they can also lead to physical health implications as well. And so one of the cycles that we see that we want to make sure that we're aware of, that we're combating, is sometimes stress and anxiety is really tied to poor sleep. And we see this a lot. We've been seeing this a lot during COVID. And we also know in Parkinson's, sleep and fatigue are also commonly occurring already. So what we don't want to happen is that we see this cycle of I'm stressed, I'm anxious, I can't go to bed, I'm staying up all night, I'm tired, either because I'm tired or because I'm physical distancing, I'm not engaging in my physical activities. This is then exacerbating physical and cognitive symptoms, and one of the implications of this could be a fall. And so we want to disrupt this cycle. So today we focus mostly on some of these psychological strategies for managing that stress and anxiety, but that doesn't really exist in a vacuum, and we want to make sure that we're also addressing healthy behaviors at the same time. So now is also, in addition to implementing some of these psychological coping strategies, we also want to be really aware that we're still engaging in healthy sleep hygiene behaviors. One thing is to make sure that we're turning off our screens before bed, a couple hours before bed, particularly the news. I've been guilty of this. Watching the news before bed is really just not a good idea right now. And in general, taking news breaks is definitely a positive thing, as long as we're continuing to stay informed as well. But practicing that good hygiene for sleep and making sure that we're still physically active, that there's a lot of resources online for physical activity plans to maintain your exercise during COVID and during physical distancing. So making sure that we're staying active. And also now is a pretty good time to do an environmental scan to make sure that our environment is also, we don't have risk factors for a fall, like clutter. Rugs are a big culprit. Making sure that the path from the bed to the bathroom, in case you wake up in the middle of the night, is lit and clear. That's another area where we see falls sometimes. So today we really focus mostly on the psychological coping strategies, and this is just a broader picture of wellness. I really want to make sure we're engaging with healthy sleep behaviors, the physical activity behaviors, and also that we're conscious of our environment as well. And so I wanted to just conclude by putting up some resources that are really helpful if you or someone is struggling and feeling overwhelmed. There's a ton of resources out there. There are national helplines for experiencing a crisis. If there's any suicidal thoughts or self-harm, the Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a great resource. Here in Colorado, we have crisis hotlines as well. And at the University of Colorado, the psychiatry department has put together a website of a lot of resources for coping with COVID. I've actually contributed a couple articles for Care Partners in the special populations section. So I would encourage you to check out those resources. And also, if you felt like the way that I talked about anxiety resonated with you, Russ Harris, who writes a lot about acceptance and commitment therapy, put together a really nice short video that's pretty engaging and easy to understand. And I would start there for additional resources. But I'll leave this screen up, and I would encourage you to take down these numbers, put them in a place that you'll have them, or share them with someone you love who might be struggling. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was awesome. And these resources look incredible. I'll have to check out that one from the CU Anschutz as well. We did have a question come in from Terry right around the time when you were talking about the cycling of anxiety, I believe. And her question is, what about anxiety that does not start with thoughts? What if it just starts on the physical level? Butterflies is what I feel first, and then the physical feelings of anxiety. I'm not thinking about anything. That's her experience.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really great question, and a good point to bring up, that a lot of times these things are happening all at once, and it's sometimes really hard to slow things down in this way, and particularly when things are moving so quickly, to halt things and to say, okay, what am I actually thinking? What am I actually feeling in the moment can be really challenging. Sometimes I would say physiological responses like those butterflies, like that breathing, is typically the easiest one that we can identify. When our body shifts, we're pretty good at noticing that. When our mind shifts, when our emotions shift, that's typically not something that we've been attuned to for a very long time. So I would say that one way to address that type of cycle, when you really notice the physiological symptoms coming on, if you're noticing any of this cycle, engaging in those types of strategies that I reviewed is beneficial. But you might want to start with some of the ones that are tailored more to combating that physiological response. So something like deep breathing, something like that grounding exercise as well, that's really allowing us to turn off our minds to bring ourselves to the present, can be really beneficial. But I think it's a really good point that we're not really noticing our thought. We don't have those tickers going across our mind where we can really notice our thoughts that easily. So a lot of times we do pay attention to physiological symptoms first. And so engaging in relaxation exercises can be really helpful there as well.
Awesome, thank you. We don't have any other questions, but please feel free to either type into your question drop-down menu anything that you have that you'd like to ask, or if you do have a microphone in your computer, feel free to click that little raise hand button and we can unmute you and you can ask your question directly. We'll keep it open for a couple more seconds. Okay. So I don't see any other questions coming in, but thank you so much for the presentation. That was awesome, and I think all of us can take away something from it as well, which thank you. So I will go ahead. Oh.
I think Elena may have frozen. This is Jody. I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. I don't see any other questions. So thank you so much for your time. And an email will be sent off to you tomorrow that will have a link to the webinar. And if you have any questions, feel free to email Elena and we can get those answered for you. Thanks so much and have a great afternoon.